She was 47 years old, and by the first frost of that autumn, she owned nothing in the world but a tin cup, a wool blanket gone thin at the corners, and $11 sewn into the hem of her only good skirt. Her name was Delphine Ashworth, and she had been cast out of her late husband's house by his brother, Cornelius Ashworth, who stood on the porch she had scrubbed for 20 years and told her, without so much as looking her in the eye, that a widow with no children and no deed had no claim on Ashworth land. So she walked the 3 miles into the river town of Cane Harbor, Missouri, with that $11 and nothing else, and at a dockside auction of abandoned and forfeited river property, she paid $4 for a houseboat that had sat half-sunk in the shallows of the Missouri River for 11 years, its roof caved with rot, its hull green with algae, a thing the auctioneer sold only because the law required him to sell it to somebody. The men on the dock laughed. They called her a fool, buying a drowned wreck no sane person would set foot in. What none of them knew, what Delphine herself did not yet know, was that sealed inside that ruined hull was something that would not only save her life, but would return to the town of Cane Harbor a truth it had spent a generation trying to bury and restore to its rightful place and name the river had never quite managed to wash away. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Delphine Ashworth. If you're watching this from a place that feels forgotten tonight, tell us where you're from in the comments. We'd love to know we're not so far apart after all. Delphine had been raised on the Kentucky side of the Ohio River, the third of 6 children born to a boat builder named Josiah Kepler, a quiet, exacting man who could coax a sound hull out of warped lumber other men would have burned for kindling. Her mother had died when Delphine was 9, and so it fell to her, being the eldest girl old enough to be useful, to keep house for her father and raise up her younger brothers. And in that raising, she learned 2 things that would follow her the rest of her days. The first was patience, the long, unglamorous patience of scrubbing pine floors and mending nets and waiting out fevers through the night with a cool cloth and a low voice, the patience that does not ask to be noticed. The second was wood. Her father, perhaps out of loneliness, perhaps because he saw in her a steadiness his sons lacked, began letting her sit with him in the boat shed on evenings when the work was done, and there he taught her to read a plank the way other men read Scripture, to run a hand along the grain and know where the rot would come, to smell whether a beam had been cured or rushed, to understand that a boat's hull was not simply wood and pitch, but a kind of promise a builder made to whoever would ride upon. The water inside it, a hole that lies to you, he told her once, will drown you in the dark, when you can't see the lie coming. She never forgot it. She married at 22, a gentle, soft-spoken riverman named Thomas Ashworth who ran freight barges along the Missouri and who had come through her father's boatyard for repairs one spring and stayed talking with her long after the work was done. Thomas was not a wealthy man, but he was an honest one, and for 20 years they lived plainly and well in a small house on Ashworth land near Cane Harbor, land that had belonged to Thomas's father before him and to his father before that. They had no children who lived past infancy. A grief Delphine carried quietly and without complaint, the way she carried most things, and in the absence of children, she poured her attention into the house, the garden, the mending of Thomas's boats, and into Thomas himself, who often said she had a builder's hands though she had never built a thing of her own. He died of a lung fever in the spring of Delphine's 46th year, coughing through a wet March, and in the confusion and sorrow of that death, no will was ever found, though Thomas had spoken often of one. His younger brother Cornelius, a man of sharp business instincts and thin loyalty, wasted no time asserting that the land had always been meant to pass to him, as the last living Ashworth son, and that Delphine, childless and without paper proof, had no standing to contest it. The county judge, an old friend of Cornelius's from cattle dealings, agreed quickly enough. Within 8 months of burying her husband, Delphine Ashworth found herself standing on the road outside the only home she had known in 2 decades, watching Cornelius's hired men carry her furniture out to be sold, keeping for herself only what she could fit into one trunk. She did not weep in front of them. She had learned that, too, somewhere, and found a boarding house that would take her for a week on the strength of the little money she had left, and began, quietly, to think about what a woman with a builder's eye and a widow's patience might still be able to make of her life. It was in that week, wandering the docks partly to clear her head and partly because the smell of river pitch and wet rope was the closest thing to comfort she had left, that she came upon the auction and the houseboat and the laughter of men who thought they understood exactly what kind of fool she was. The houseboat had belonged, the auctioneer said with a shrug, to a riverman who had died without kin sometime around 1877, and the county had simply let it sit, sinking a little further into the Missouri mud with each spring flood, until it became less a piece of property than a local eyesore the town occasionally grumbled about and never got around to removing. Its name, painted in letters so faded they were more suggestion than word, had once read the Constance. Delphine paid her $4, watched the auctioneer's clerk scratch her name into the ledger with visible amusement, and walked down to stand at the water's edge looking at what she had bought. It sat tilted in the shallows, half its length submerged, its little cabin roof furred green with moss, one shutter hanging by a single hinge like a broken wing. She thought, standing there with $7 now to her name and nowhere to sleep after the boarding house week ran out, that perhaps she had indeed lost her sense entirely. But she also thought of her father's hands on old wood, and something in her, some stubborn, unkillable thing, told her that a hole that had held together through 11 years of flood and freeze had not done so by accident. It took her 4 days of waiting, bailing, and prying to get the Constance floated enough to drag her onto a strip of gravel bank downriver from the main docks, where the town's attention did not much reach, and there she began the slow work of opening the boat up to the light. The cabin within was ruined beyond much saving. The floorboards soft, the little iron stove rusted through, a shelf of moldered books collapsed into pulp, and Delphine worked through it patiently, salvaging what could be salvaged and hauling the rest to burn. It was on the 4th day, prying up a section of the cabin floor that her father's trained, I told her sat unnaturally high, that she found the first clue. Not treasure, not yet, but a hollow beneath the floorboards where no hollow ought to be, sealed with a lid of tarred canvas so tightly fitted that 11 years of river water had never once seeped through. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth gone stiff but intact, she found a small tin box, and inside that, a single folded letter, its ink still legible, addressed to no one and signed only with the initials E.T. The letter was dated the 14th of June, 1877, and it was, Delphine realized as she read it by lamplight that night, a kind of confession, though not of wrongdoing, of fear. It spoke of a man who called himself the last honest riverman on this stretch of water, who wrote that he was hiding what he had built because certain men in Cane Harbor would see it burned or buried before they'd see it given to the people it was meant for. It spoke of a ledger, kept somewhere safe within the boat, and of a debt owed, not money. The letter said, but land and dignity, in a name that had been scrubbed out of the town's memory the way a stain is scrubbed from floor until you'd never know it had been there at all. It ended with a single line that Delphine read 3 times before she understood the chill it sent through her. If you have found this, you have found the Constance honest, and I am asking you to finish what I could not. She spent the next several days searching the hull with a thoroughness that came as naturally to her as breathing, running her hands along every seam the way her father had taught her, tapping for hollowness. And it was in the keel itself, in a compartment built with a craftsman's care into the boat's very spine, that she found the ledger the letter had promised. It was a heavy, cloth-bound book, its pages foxed but whole, and as Delphine turned through it by lamplight, she began to understand exactly what she was holding and why a man named E.D. had felt the need to seal it inside a boat and let the river hide it for him. The ledger belonged to Ezekiel Tanner, and it recorded, in a careful, patient hand, the founding of a settlement on the river bluff just north of what was now Cane Harbor, a settlement of freed families, established in the years just after the war, on land Ezekiel Tanner had legally purchased and surveyed himself, with deeds and payments recorded down to the penny. The ledger traced the settlement's slow growth. A mill, a chapel, a school, families' names Delphine did not recognize, but which the ledger listed with evident pride: the Coles, the Marchettis, the Freemans, the Odoms. And then, abruptly, in an entry dated 1874, an account of a fire that took the mill and the chapel in a single night that the county did not trouble itself to investigate, and a subsequent purchase, at a fraction of its worth, of the entire bluff by a syndicate whose principal buyer the ledger named plainly as one Silas Renwick, a name Delphine recognized at once, because Renwick was the name on the largest building in Cane Harbor, the Renwick Mercantile and Bank, the same institution that held the note on what had, until recently, been Ashworth land, and whose current president, she would soon learn, was the grandson of that same Silas Renwick. The ledger's final entry, written in a hand grown shakier than the rest, recorded that Ezekiel Tanner had managed to buy back a single corner of the bluff under a different, unremarkable name, quietly before he died, so that not all of it would be lost, even if no one remembers why it matters. Delphine sat with that ledger in her lap long into the night, feeling the particular weight of holding a truth that other people had worked very hard to make disappear, and understanding, with the plainness of a woman who had spent her life reading grain and wood, that she had not stumbled on a treasure so much as onto a debt that had never been paid. She did not act rashly. She had learned patience too well for that. Instead, she spent the following weeks where she found, beneath the brush, the collapsed stone foundation of what must have been the chapel, and a scatter of hand-cut nails, and a single cracked millstone half buried in leaf mold, silent evidence that the ledger had not lied. She found, too, in the county courthouse, that the bluff was indeed recorded under Renwick Land and Improvement, and that a smaller parcel at its northern edge was still held, oddly, under a name she did not at first recognize, Constance Freeman, until she realized with a slow chill that it was surely the very name Ezekiel Tanner had used to buy back his corner in secret, and the very name he had painted, in tribute, on the bow of the houseboat he built to hide his ledger in plain sight upon the water he loved. She began asking careful questions of the town's older residents, framing herself merely as a curious new resident patching together local history, and found that most who remembered anything at all remembered only a vague, uneasy story about the colored settlement that burned, told the way people tell a story they have silently agreed not to look at too closely. It did not take long for her questions to reach Silas Renwick the Younger, who called upon her at the gravel bank where the Constance now sat propped and half-repaired, with a politeness so thin it barely covered its own edges. He introduced himself as a man concerned for her welfare, alone as she was and living as she was in what he called a derelict, and offered, with the air of a great kindness, to buy the houseboat and its content from her outright for $25, more than 6 times what she had paid, to save her the trouble of it. Delphine, who by then understood precisely what trouble he wished to spare himself, thanked him and declined, and watched something behind his composed face go cold. Within the week, the county sent a notice that her gravel bank mooring violated an ordinance no one had previously heard enforced, and Cornelius Ashworth, who, Delphine now understood, banked with Renwick and owed him more than he could easily repay, began telling anyone who would listen in town that his late brother's widow had gone strange in her grief, poking about ruins and making wild claims that could only embarrass the family further. The town, uncertain and inclined toward the comfort of its own established stories, largely sided with the man who had always held its notes and its favor. Delphine found herself, for a second time in a single year, made small and doubted by people who had never once asked her what she actually knew. But she had the ledger, and she had her father's old habit of not being rushed by other people's impatience. And she realized as she sat one evening mending the Constance's cabin wall with salvage boards, something Silas Renwick did not. She had nothing left to lose, which meant she also had nothing left to fear losing. She wrote, in her own careful hand, letters to the county land office and to a newspaperman in the capital who had, some years before, written sympathetically about freedmen's settlements dispossessed after the war, enclosing copies she made of key ledger pages and a plain, unembellished account of what she had found and where. She did not accuse. She simply laid the plank down and let anyone who cared to look see the grain of it. She also, patiently, tracked down descendants. A Marchetti grandson, now farming 40 miles east, an elderly woman named Odom living with her daughter in the next county, both of whom, when Delphine visited and showed them the ledger with its careful listing of their own family names among the settlement's founders, wept in a way that told her more plainly than any argument could that she had found something true. The reckoning, when it came, arrived not as a dramatic confrontation, but as the slow, grinding turn of paper against paper, which Delphine understood was the only kind of justice men like Silas Renwick truly feared. The newspaper man came and wrote what he saw, and the story ran under a headline that made Cane Harbor's comfortable forgetting considerably harder to maintain. The county land office, faced with the original deeds Ezekiel Tanner had recorded decades before and never legally surrendered, opened an inquiry into the 1874 transfer and found, buried in its own dusty files, a record of the purchase made at a price so far beneath assessed value that even the most incurious clerk could see the shape of the theft. Silas Renwick, cornered by his own bank's records and by descendants now standing, for the first time in a generation, in a courthouse to speak their family's name aloud, chose not to fight a public trial that would air every particular of his grandfather's fire and his own father's silence, and instead accepted a settlement that returned the bluff, the whole of it. Chapel foundation and millstone and all, to a trust established in the names of the original founding families, with Delphine, at the family's own insistence, named as a trustee alongside them for having carried Ezekiel Tanner's ledger safely home. Cornelius Ashworth, whose debts to Renwick's bank came due just as Renwick's own standing in town crumbled, and his willingness to extend easy grace crumbled with it, found himself, within the year, forced to sell off the very Ashworth land he had turned Delphine out of, in order to satisfy what he owed. A turn of fortune Delphine took no pleasure in describing to anyone, though she noticed, quietly, that the river has its own way of returning what is owed, in its own season, without needing her help at all. With her small share of the settlement, and with the trust's blessing, Delphine did not buy back a fine house or seek any grand vindication. She used the money instead to finish restoring the Constance properly, plank by honest plank, the way her father had taught her a hull ought to be built, to hold its promise even in the dark, and she moored it, at last, at the foot of the bluff itself, where she helped the founding family's descendants clear the old chapel ground and lay, with her own hands and the skill she had carried since childhood, the first new timbers of a meeting house raised on the very foundation Ezekiel Tanner's. People had built and lost and were, after 50 years, finally reclaiming. And so we come back to where we began, to a woman of 47 with $11 and nowhere to sleep, standing at a river's edge being laughed at for the foolishness of her purchase. Delphine Ashworth had lost a husband, a home, and the good opinion of a town that judged her by what she lacked rather than by what she carried inside her, patience, a builder's eye, and the quiet, stubborn faith that a well-made thing, however drowned or forgotten it looks, still holds its shape underneath. The Constance had cost her $4 and had been called a wreck no sane person would touch, and yet it had been the one honest thing in Cane Harbor all along, keeping faith with a dead man's promise through 11 years of flood and silence, until someone came who knew how to listen old wood. What Delphine restored was never really a boat. It was a name, a settlement, a ledger of families the river town had tried to let sink along with the vessel that guarded their story, and in restoring it she restored something in herself as well. Proof that being overlooked is not the same as being worthless, and that sometimes the very thing the world calls foolish to want is the thing it most needs someone brave enough to want anyway. Thank you for sitting with us through Delphine's story tonight, and for giving your evening to a tale about a woman, a wreck, and a truth that outlasted the men who tried to bury it. If this story stayed with you, we'd be grateful if you'd share it with someone who needs a reminder that value doesn't always announce itself with a shine. Sometimes it waits quietly, sealed away, for someone patient enough to find it. Before you go, we'd love to hear from you. What is a time in your own life when you found real worth in something everyone else had already written off? Tell us in the comments below. We read everyone. Until next time, stay close.